Yes, sir, at the back there.
Okay, this is directed to the man who's talking about Neville.
John.
Yeah, sorry, okay, John, it's to yourself, John. I just want to, could you elaborate, however, on Neville's connections to the theatre, because you've got a lot of evidence here about his Italian connections, this is interesting, but I'd like to know a little bit more about what his connections to the theatre are.
Well, that wasn't the topic of the day, so that's why there's nothing in the paper about theatre. The first and most important document is the Northumberland Manuscript, which has Neville's name at the top, is dated 1576 to 7, has the plays listed of Richard II, Richard III, the name William Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, William Shakespeare at the bottom. It quotes The Rape of Lucrece and has a word from Love's Labour's Lost, and it is acknowledged by scholars to have belonged to Neville, Henry Neville, and it therefore predates the identification of William Shakespeare as the author of any play by at least a year. So Henry Neville knew who wrote Richard II and Richard III and quoted from a poem before anybody else knew.
Since 96.
Well, I've actually studied it a lot, and I've gone 96/97.
That's what I mean, yeah.
Because of,
You said
my
76.
study. No, sorry, 96, 97.
Yeah.
So that's the first connection. On that document, there's also a mention of Nash and the Isle of Dogs. Henry Neville, there are members of the Neville family throughout the Shakespeare history plays, and that's my next book. Fletcher and Beaumont dedicated one of their plays, gave Neville the manuscript of The King and No King just before Fletcher starts writing with Shakespeare the last three plays. So that's a quick answer.
Great. Oh, thanks very much for that, John. And I think it's worth saying, I know a lot of you will know this already, the Northumberland Manuscript is an extremely interesting, quite mysterious artifact that there's not a lot of agreement on what it actually is, so it's worth researching further. Thanks for that. Yes, sir, up the background.
As concise as I can.
That sounds...
Give me a chance. We missed somebody out in our candidates, and that is William of Stratford. Now, I think that we have to take account in some way of his contribution to the whole process, because whatever this was, it was such a hot potato that without a subterfuge on whichever other candidate we believe in, these works could not have survived. But they survived at a price, and that price has gone on being paid. And the question is about the nature of that price. One of the things that's come out from the discussion of Shakespeare in Italy, but it comes out in many other areas as well, is that Stratfordian thinking used to be broad enough to look at the evidence. But what has happened, it seems to me, is that there's been a narrowing down of Stratfordian thinking, so that the great critical thinkers no longer come from Stratford. But unfortunately they're not coming yet, as far as I can see, from any alternatives. In other words, we're locked in this battle, and it's killing critical thinking.
So what would your question be, sir?
The question is whether the panel think that degeneration of Shakespeare critical thinking is considerably due to the authorship question and its impact, or whether it's part of the general dumbing down of our times.
Okay, thank you. Who would like to take that on?
I'll start.
Yes, Kevin?
Okay.
Since about 1998, there have been about 15 major biographies of Shakespeare, I think we're looking at, written by academics, and I think this is a way in which they can make easy money. So they can come up with a series of questions like, what was the relationship with his wife? Well, we don't know, we don't have any evidence. So he had a wonderful, loving relationship with his wife. She was very supportive and helpful too. She was a complete shrew, cold bed and everything else. I think a lot of it is on the part of the writers, just a chance to cash in, part of the academics to cash in, and the publishers as well. They know there's a great interest in the biography, and I agree with you, I don't think there's very much critical investigation as to what really goes on.
Thank you. Hank.
Well, I think that those biographies you mentioned are based on works. Shakespeare, the author, not Shakespeare, the man that can be followed in any specific way. And after 1920, when Loney came up with Oxford, that restriction you're talking about began, the dumbing down. He didn't know Latin, he didn't go to, and you can't really talk about in that same grandiose way, the writers you mentioned, if the man you're talking about is constricted that much. They realize subterraneanly that there's a problem. So, for example, 4 or 5 years ago, I went to a debate at the Smithsonian, and Gail Kern-Pastor, who was to be the head of the Folger, said, well, Shakespeare was terrible at Latin. He knew nothing of Latin. And, you know, I thought to myself, this is one of the great writers who really does know Latin. And certainly our candidate at the time, Oxford, had written a beautiful Latin preface to, I believe it was the Castiglione. Yeah, so the dumbing down was still happening. And I think that's partially the reason. Partially the reason. I think it's starting to happen the other way, though. We're beginning to open up the vista, and what you're seeing in this conference is an answer, response to that.
Yeah.
And I think those writers and that writing will come.
Anyone else?
I do see that what you described, that the academic approach to Shakespeare used to be broad enough to, they would once say, yes, it's okay, he went to Italy. And in fact, up until the 1920s, there were parts of the canon that they would happily give to Marlowe. Several very eminent scholars gave the Henry VI plays, Taming the Shrew, Titus Andronicus to Marlowe, and just said sort of, well, Shakespeare kind of nabbed it, stole it, twisted it a bit, and it ended up in the folio. And then that became, with Peter Alexander and the New Orthodoxy in the late 1920s, those people were called the disintegrators, and the whole thing got shut down. And this is where the resistance, and it really is about the 1920s, it is about Loney's book, the resistance to the authorship question has created a huge distortion in Orthodox scholarship. So that many of the things that they're sort of ludicrous things they say about Italy, like the absurd canals, is created by the pressure of the authorship question that they don't even want to acknowledge. Quite often they just don't even want to acknowledge it, but they're doing things like the stylometry. I think so much of the work that's being done now in Orthodox Shakespeare studies is actually influenced entirely by the presence of the authorship question without them even stating it. So that Hand D, that actually came, it was openly declared as something that was trying to link Shakespeare of Stratford with a scrap of manuscript, even though not sufficient sample size, even the signatures themselves are not consistent. It's entirely unscientific approach, and yet it's so well. I mean, they're so desperate to cling to this straw that when I saw the British Museum exhibition last year, the scrap of Sir Thomas More with Hand D, it actually said Shakespeare's handwriting on it. And this just is shoddy scholarship, and it's come about because they are resisting the pressure of the authorship question. They cannot bear it, and so they end up saying ludicrous things,
Do they believe it?
Yes.
They so need to believe it, and they do believe it. Yeah, they do. They do believe it. I honestly don't think they're lying. They're genuinely, passionately defending the truth from their point of view.
But it is the elephant in the room, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
actually is below the surface. It's driving.
It's driving that all the. I mean, the stylometry, the new thing, is all about co-authorship, which they now have morphed into collaboration because they see that as an antidote to the authorship question, and they think it's an answer. And so, interestingly, they're actually now disintegrating the canon themselves.
Very good.
Good. Okay, John, do you want to say something there? No? Okay. There was a question. Oh yeah.
It's to John. Back to the Northumberland paper. There's another name on that front page. It says Henry Neville, and then several times it says Francis Bacon. I just wonder if you could imagine collaboration between Neville and Bacon.
Neville and Bacon were related. Neville's mother was Bacon's step-sister. So they definitely knew each other. And I think there would be some thing going on in the Comedy of Errors, because Bacon wrote speeches for that season of the...
Just the Grail.
Yes. Those are mentioned on the Northumberland Manuscript, front page. So we know that they knew each other, they were both in Parliament. Neville stayed loyal to Essex, and that's an important issue in the Shakespeare identity, because Shakespeare was clearly an Essex supporter, whereas Bacon prosecuted Essex. And it may be that Bacon and Cecil together saved Neville's life in that process, because they were both related to Neville when he fell foul of the authorities in the Essex Rebellion. So there was definitely a connection.
Great, thanks. Yes, sir.
Thank you. How can I put this? You've drawn no specific conclusions, but you have demonstrated some advocacy. Can I just turn it back a wee bit and ask, have you all come to the same conclusion as to why the authorship has been so successfully concealed? And why was it concealed in the first place? Perhaps that's a given.
I don't think there's any agreement on that, is there? It really depends on which candidate you favour as to why it be concealed. In Marlowe's case, it's very straightforward. He's supposed to be dead.
Well, I'll go back before the candidacy. Why has the authorship been concealed?
I could answer one answer. There are probably many. Like a snowball going down the hill, getting bigger and bigger. The best way to create a mythology is not to do it yourself, but let others do it. So over generations, more people write, more people fill in the blanks with their imagination, and pretty soon you have these biographies that are incredible. And it's all based on nothing. Little flimsy connections, but that's what we have. And that flourished. And I think part of the flourishing was the great writing that came out of that. We don't deny some of the great writers, but it's all a snowball of mythology. However, the plays are real. So what these writers then attach to the plays and give us has been wonderful. It's just that the real author, has been lost, and so therefore a million other aspects have been lost.
Sorry to interrupt. I understand that. My question is, why?
Why? Well, it's a religion. It's a mythology.
No.
John's got an answer for you.
Henry Neville has an interlocking series of reasons. Yeah. His father and he were involved in secret work for the government. Yeah. He was involved in secret work with the Bacons and Anthony Bacon and so on. He was involved in spying in France and information and so on. His father looked after Mary Queen of Scots briefly, and he was involved in the house arrest of the Duke of Norfolk, who was trying to marry the Mary Queen of Scots. So they were involved in secret work. Neville's father was a signatory of Henry VIII's will. So they were very high up, and Walsingham set up the Queen's Players in 1583, when he and Neville and Essex went to Scotland together on a secret diplomatic mission. Yeah. So there were political reasons why Neville would want to keep his identity secret. Neville was also illegitimate. His father and mother, Elizabeth, had Neville before they were officially married. Had that been discovered, Neville could have lost one of the greatest inheritances of the time. And the name Falconbridge, which is in King John, where this very issue of the potential loss of inheritance is explored in King John, named Falconbridge is a family name of the Nevilles. So the bastard Falconbridge is a real historical person. And it's interesting that William Shakespeare uses the name Falconbridge again and again and again in early plays, and stops using it when just before the Essex Rebellion, a play about the historical Falkland Bridges says, watch out, the Nevilles can be dangerous. Yeah. So Neville had a set of interlocking psychological and personal reasons for keeping his identity secret, and it freed him up to write whatever he wanted. If he had been exposed as the real writer, he would have not been free. And you only have to go to Iranian writers now to discover that they're in a dictatorship and writing under pseudonyms so that they're free to write what they want.
Okay, thanks, John. Ross?
Can I contribute a candidate neutral answer? It was a very dangerous time to be a writer. No matter who the author or authors were, it was not at all unusual to conceal your identity. It was often things were published anonymously or with pseudonyms. And in this instance, one of the things that really struck me when I'm looking again at the evidence recently for a talk I was doing was that Ben Jonson does seem to be key in all this. He does put the first folio prefatory material together, and his poetape epigram is important to consider, I think, because he does talk about a broker who is allowing plays that he has represented to be thought of as his own. And there are other people like Robert Greene who talks about people letting some Batillus set his work to their verses, so he that cannot sign his name without the help of parish clerks. But interestingly, of course, Jane Cox of the Public Record Office has said that she thinks some of those signatures might be by clerks, the Shakespeare signatures. But that essentially he was set up to be someone's front. He was a businessman, he's a middleman. If you look at the profile of his evidence, it's hugely about being a middleman. The whole reason why he's hoarding grain in a time of famine is he's not a grain producer, he's not a farmer. He buys it when it's cheap, he sells it when it's expensive. That's hoarding grain in a time of famine. You look at his profile in the Belloc Mountjoy case, he's a broker, he brokers a marriage, he's a middleman, he does it again and again. Why not, once he's involved in the theatre, which was documented from 1594, would he not also broker plays? We know that people did it. The George Buck evidence, it looks like when he's going to find attributions that he's actually questioning him in that capacity. Ed Juby, who's the other person he asks about Georgia Green, worked in that capacity. He bought and sold plays for his company. So what I think is possibly there was a person or persons wanting to conceal their identity. More than one of these writers allowed William Shakespeare to be the broker. William Shakespeare's name appears on plays by writers we know not to be the author of Hamlet. And that over time, he just allowed people to believe, as Ben Jonson says, and this just became an accepted truth. And then after his death, Ben Jonson and associates wanted to set up both the Stratford Monument and the folio such that this thing could eventually be uncovered. So they left all these really odd anomalies and enigmas in there. But that it just becomes something that people thought and were allowed to think that was actually his role. He was protecting whoever's behind it, and it just became the truth, as things do when they're repeated often enough.
Okay, Kevin?
Just a small bit to add on to what Ross was saying. The histories, there are two major histories that were produced during the Tudor period. One is Edmund Hall's history of whatever it was, and that was produced posthumously. So the person who's actually putting it to print and then distributing it at the time of Edward VI he's not putting his own name to it, he's putting the name of a dead person who had written probably up until about 1530, and all that later bit from the Henry VIII bit to do with the divorce and which child was legitimate, which one wasn't, is all written slanted in favour of Edward VI. And so the person who put it is probably Richard Grafton, the printer who was printed to the King, didn't want to put his own name to it, which is quite good. And then the second one, Holinshead Chronicles, major source, second major source for, who's Holinshead? Look him up. We know nothing about him. There is probably a person called Holinshead, and that's it. And I think that these two were both put out by Burley, that he used a front man, and that, in my view, according to the Oxfordian hypothesis, is that Burley is using Oxford to write pro-Elizabeth, pro-establishment plays, history plays especially, and he's putting this pseudonym onto there to make sure. Because otherwise, if you know it's this Neville or Oxford or Marlowe, then you can start attacking them. But when the players come out in the middle of Hamlet, nobody said, sorry, it wasn't me, he made me write those 12 lines, sorry, blame him. Nobody says that. When Claudius is angry, They are very quiet, and there's nobody accusing the players of doing it, of complicity. So I think that it's very much a protection issue, and I can see reasons why Oxford and others would have been protected.
Right, okay.
Could I just
You as well.
just following up on Roz's point, in 1678, I think it was, Edward Ravenscroft was putting on a production of Titus Andronicus, and he is reported as saying, I have heard from someone anciently acquainted with the stage that William Shakespeare did not write Titus Andronicus. It was brought to him by a private author, and he just added some touches to it. Now that's, you know...
Good, okay, thank you, Julia. So I think you've got a good answer to your question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it was more like in direct response to the gentleman just here, and then Mr. Whittemore, when he answered, and I just thought, the first thing that came into my mind was Stratford-on-Avon Town Hall is in pretty poor repair, so they rake in David Garrett, they have to put on the Jubilee because they needed the money. And money, and then later, professional reputation is why you've got your big cover-up. Once it had started, once that Jubilee was running, and the name of Shakespeare was writ large in the English history, and remember that not a single Shakespeare play was put on during the Jubilee.
Okay.
I have to
I think that's where
make a comment about Roz's wonderful answer there. And it's just one thing, that we still, I believe, are giving, I know he hoarded grain and I know all the other things you mentioned, but we are still giving the Stratford man a biography that we don't know that he has. I might say that they're only in the Elizabethan reign, up to 1603 in the succession. There are 2 documents that connect William Shakespeare with the Lord Chamberlain's men. One is the 1595 payee with Burbage and Kemp. If you believe Shakespeare is part of that trinity, it's nuts. He can't be. That's my opinion. But in any case, it's Shakespeare. And in 99, it's the Shakespeare's part of the ground lease sharer to get the ground lease for the Globe. In each case, it does not say William of Stratford. So we have to beware of giving him the biography. There's such a thing as backfitting.
For sure. So, but in the will where he's obviously connected, and in fact not just in that will, but in the other will where he's given, Augustine Phillips, and then where they refer to fellows.
I might say this is after the succession, and I believe that there's a big political story going on. That after the succession, there was an attempt to begin to relate him to the plays, not the Stratford man, but Shakespeare as an actor. You notice Johnson comes up with his folio in 1616, 3 months after the Stratford man's death. He doesn't link to Stratford. He puts Shakespeare at the head of 2 casts of his plays, Sejanus and Every Man in His Humor. This is part of the attempt to link him as an actor. And then it goes all the way to the folio, which very slightly, the Stratford Monument and the Avon, you have to put that together. If you read that at the time, you would not go to Stratford right away. You would have to, be a genius. But he still, I might say, is an actor in the folio, and he's not a poet. He has no sonnets, no poems, and those poems and sonnets are let me say, red hot. They're the stuff of what could be suppressed and was wanted to be suppressed. That's my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
It's a question for the executive candidates in reference to poems.
Yes.
Why would you feel the need in 1592 to approach a 19-year-old Earl of Southampton?
Say it again.
Why is there a need to approach the Earl of Southampton in 1592?
93 and 94? Well, it's one of the big mysteries of Shakespeare, right? We all have our opinions about that, about who Southampton was and what his relationship was to the real author, who introduced. It's very significant that the real author, if it's a pen name, introduced his pen name in 1593, not on the title page of 2 poems, Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece, but in the dedication to Southampton. The second of which was over the top. The love I dedicate to your lordship is without end. What I've done is yours, what I have to do is yours. Being part, you know. So there's a heart of a mystery.
John, you want to answer that?
I've written a study of Southampton and Neville, showing that Neville knew Southampton over a 30-year period. He met Southampton when he was a boy at Burley School, and when Neville was being considered a candidate for the secretaryship after Cecil's death, Southampton was named as his patron, and they were linked to each other as Dear Damon and Pythias in a letter, and that play, Damon and Pythias, is mentioned in Hamlet. So we know over 30 years, in letters, in contacts, in references, that Henry Neville and Southampton were intimately linked, and they spent 2 years in the Tower of London after the Essex Rebellion together. So the person who betrayed Neville was the Earl of Essex and Southampton in his confession after the Essex Rebellion. So the person who in the sonnets, who is the betrayer of the writer, is Southampton, and the final play is about two men in prison who are friends, the two noble kinsmen. So there's a whole raft of evidence connecting Neville to Southampton.
The Earl of Oxford's daughter, Elizabeth Vere, was being lined up to marry Southampton, and Venus and Adonis is fairly obviously trying to encourage a young man to get married. And a lot of people say there's this Shakespeare encouraging him. Now, to write a love, or to write poetry of that sort to a 19-year-old, I mean, when I wrote my long poem to Prince William at the age of 19, I was locked up in the Tower. Prince Harry didn't mind. But I agree that for a commoner to address a person like that, but at that time, Southampton was a ward. He did not have any money. He wasn't in a position to patronise anybody. So if you look up the ODNB and see Park Honan's article in there, that explains why. So I think that initially, Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, is lining up his daughter to get married because there's a whole bunch of money in it. Secondly, I wouldn't be surprised if there are homosexual overtones, that he himself fancies this young chap who's an attractive boy and swung both ways by the sound of it. Who knows why the following year he writes The Rape of Lucrece? You know, I think it's fairly obvious.
There is an Italian connection to this, which you've missed totally. John Florio was living in Titchfield, and he was a tutor to the Earl of Southampton.
Yeah. Well, in 1598, he says, for some time I have been in the Earl of Southampton's household, but we don't know where that household is. And in 1593, Southampton was still in Cecil House in London, so there wasn't any Titchfield connection there, and it's unlikely that Florio was attached to Southampton before Southampton reached majority at the age of 21. If you go to, and this is my argument, I've written about that in one of my essays, which is on the De Vere website, so if you want to look into it a bit more and answer it, I'll be delighted.
Okay, one final point for John on this, and then
in 1603, just before Southampton and Neville were released from the Tower on James I's order, Southampton wrote a version of a defence of Richard III and dedicated it to Henry Neville.
Okay.
I should say I've got quite a lot of friends who are Stratfordians. The interest in stylometry and of course the interest in hand D, do you think that the handwriting in hand D will lead to any particular candidate? And do you think stylometric studies will lead to any particular candidate?
Rose, you've been working on this.
Yeah. No, I don't think hand D is going to lead to any particular candidate for lots of reasons, and it really cannot in any. I mean, I came from a science background, and I look at the work on hand D and I kind of despair in terms of things like sample size. It's ludicrous. Now, stylometry is a different matter, but it is still in its infancy, and as it stands at the moment, it's not poised to make any great breakthroughs, and I think a lot of the claims that are made on
Do you want to
it...
explain what it is, just in case anyone doesn't know?
Okay, so well, it's particularly computer stylometry, it's all done mostly through computers now, although some people are, like Don and Murphy, are doing things painstakingly by hand. But it's essentially trying to deduce fingerprints of style from blocks of text and setting them against other blocks of text. Now, there are some serious problems with it. For example, if you there was a very famous paper called Winnowing the Claimants, and then there were none, by a couple of guys called Elliott and Valenza. And they claim to have ruled out all the major authorship candidates through computer stylometry. There's a massive problem with the fact that it doesn't work at all where you've got different genres. So you could take one author who has written non-fiction and they've written plays, and if you run them both through these stylometry programs, they will come out as two separate authors. You can also take the canon of a single author over a period of 20 years, split it in half, treat them as author A and B, and you will come up with they are two separate authors. Date is rarely date of writing, and we cannot even reliably date the plays, which is a real problem. We don't actually really know.
Buy the book.
I know, they also but there are other arguments, there are multiple arguments for this play being here, 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 here. Unless you have a way of actually reliably ordering them, it's very difficult, because stylometry must take date of writing into account, because an author's style develops and changes. Someone does not write the same in their 20s as they do in their 40s. You know, style develops and changes and is influenced by external things as well as a kind of internal evolution. Often when you look at these things, the methodologies are exceedingly dodgy. Sample sizes are insufficient. One of the worst ones I saw, the Elliott and Valenza dismissal of Marlowe, was a great one. They did it on one test, which was called, what was it called, buckets of something. Buckets of badges, that's right. Well, they identified, there's lots of different ways you can do it to make your point. So you devise 50 different stylometry tests, and then you cherry pick the ones that give the result that you want, and then you publish that in a paper. Unfortunate, and the trouble is that some humanities folk are really gullible on this. They think, oh, this is science and it uses computers and it must be true. And so then Stratfordians are going, well, that's sorted that out, hasn't it? And it really hasn't. Marlowe was dismissed on the basis of this. They took a bunch of texts, 7 plays that they called Not Shakespeare. This is our control group, and we're going to test all these texts by other authors against our control text. And essentially 3 out of the 7 plays that were going to be called Not Shakespeare were by Marlowe. And then, surprise, surprise, when they ran Marlowe's canon against the control text, it matched Not Shakespeare, because they'd used Marlowe to create the control text. He matched himself. That's not that surprising. And they actually say in their conclusions that this test is sufficient to rule out Marlowe as a candidate. Now, what kind of methodology is that? This stuff needs absolutely picking apart, because and the awful thing is most people look at it and they just go, oh, maths, oh no. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to pull it apart soon.
Can I just add one thing? That in those days there were a lot of dictation. I know the Earl of Oxford, whether he was Shakespeare or not, had many of the writers around him that became known as Shakespeare's sources. That would include Lilly, his personal secretary, Watson Lodge, and particularly Anthony Munday, who I may be wrong, but some people have attached his handwriting to the hand D.
Well, Anthony Munday is supposed to be the main author of Sir Thomas More, and other people have argued that hand D it's got all the signs that come of scribal copying. There are various errors that have been made. I think it's Gerald Downes who looks at there are certain mistakes that people naturally make when they're copying, when they're scribing, and those are very present in hand D. So he argues that it's the hand of a scribe anyway.
John.
Okay, I've done a study of hand D and Neville's handwriting from extant examples of Neville's handwriting. I found a number of good indicators. Hand D is the only bit of Sir Thomas More where the writer abbreviates words beginning with P-A-R or P-E-R. So pardon becomes P-D-O-N. I've checked all the other writers and none of the rest of them do it. But I have good examples of Neville doing it in his own notebooks and handwriting, where he abbreviates Parliament to P-L-I-A-M-E-N-T. Neville also has a strange habit of writing knig instead of king by reversing the N and the I. So he writes aganist, A-G-A-N-I-S-T, instead of against. And you'll find that in Hand D. So apart from the fact that Neville does use spurred A's in other writing, there's enough evidence to suggest that Hand D could be by Neville, but I'm not making a final judgment on it.
I think the greatest works in history could be written by somebody who can't spell king.
It's a bit like a dyslexic. You haven't got the spelling must stand for that, of course.
I mean, can I actually say something in response to the stylometrics? I think what Ros says is correct. It is hugely problematic and very difficult for humanities scholars to get their heads around because it's so enormous, you know, the testing. However, I would say it's one field in Shakespeare studies that's having the biggest impact as we speak on how we view Shakespeare and how the plays came to be written, because it's stylometrics, generally with Brian Vickers in London, saying, you know, a lot of these plays we can see that they were collaborative.
Yes.
And if that's the case, then, you know, for me, the first folio is not an accurate representation of what Shakespeare wrote because it's only his name on it. Now, for me, it opens up Pandora's box.
Two small points. On the poetry, a lot of people say, oh, well, isn't it sad that the Earl of Oxford's poetry is so poor? And I don't think this is true. At the front of that book there, Discovering Shakespeare, you see, were I king, I could command contempt. And so he's written in verse forms that Shakespeare, whoever the author was, has used. And an American academic in the 1930s called Benezet, B-E-N-E-Z-E-T, came up with a test of 80 lines where he spliced together bits of Oxford, bits of Shakespeare, and he said, okay, if one's so good and one's so bad, why don't you have a go at telling me this? And I think I've tried this on various students, and people cannot distinguish which one is Shakespeare or where one bit ends and another begins. So for me, this is a bit farcical. Secondly, I agree with everything, especially what Ros was saying, but an author like Shakespeare, he can adapt his language to whoever's speaking. So if Falstaff is speaking, that's Falstaff, and he's got a certain style of speech compared to somebody else. So obviously, you know, that you can say, well, how many different styles are there? How many people? But on the collaboration, I think that these are shorter plays that were left behind. Somebody else came along and they said, right, can you go and add a couple of acts to Pericles? So you've got this co-authorship, whereby you've got an identifiable bit by one author and a different section identifiable by another author. And I don't think they're sitting in the same room. I don't think they're writing at the same time. I think what's happening is they're expanding. Sorry, Bill.
Thanks. John, one final point, and then we'll have one more question.
One of Shakespeare's early collaborators was George Peele, who's now been identified as the probable author of the first version of King John. Peele and Neville both went to Oxford, and Shakespeare rewrote King John in 1596 when Peele died. So he was free to rewrite it, but interestingly, he cut out the Earl of Oxford from much of the story of King John.
Okay, that's a good point, yeah. So, one final question, a real, to end on, yes sir.
Well, I wanted to ask whether the SAT had changed its charter, because I signed the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt as a doubting Stratfordian. And after Alexander's presentation this morning, he was descending to petty name-calling that the Birthplace Trust have descended to, and it seems to be anyone except Stratford. I mean, Ross was, I've been coming for years, and Ross's data wrangling ideas is what I've been thinking about for years, what's necessary to organise the evidence.
Let me say, Alexander Ward is not a member or a trustee of the Shakespeare and Authorship Trust.
It's the first year I felt unwelcome.
He's the chairman or something of the Shakespeare and Authorship Coalition. I think it's an American organisation. It's nothing to do with the SAT, but was invited here. In many ways, it's a fair enough point. Everyone kind of gets their say, and we have to deal with it as we deal with it. But I take your point.
If William from Stratford was involved, and it's highly likely he was, he did his job brilliantly well and completely fulfilled his function. Yeah? So I think it's a good time, as Poynton doesn't attack William. Poynton's book on the man who never was Shakespeare explains who he was and what evidence there is, and he must have been involved and he must have done an excellent job.
I can make a case for William of Stratford.
Wow, why has no one ever thought of that before?
Not in the traditional
I
biography.
don't think contempt is an argument.
Can I just say, please keep to the high ground?
Okay. Right.
And please do come again.
Yes.
Yeah. No name calling.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, let's. Okay. So one more question, and that's it.
Am I allowed? Sorry, second time round. Do you have a shared view on whether the plays were written by the same person or persons who wrote the sonnets?
That's a good one to end. So let's just have one-word answers. How about that, Ross?
Can't do a one-word answer.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, yes,
Roughly
thank you, John.
Roughly speaking, yes. But obviously there are more hands than one in the plays, and I see the sonnets as the work of one person, but who was also involved in the plays chiefly. If you like, a chief author.
Okay.
I'd second that. Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yes.
Same as them, or
Yes. My answer is yes, the same one.
okay.
I agree with what Rosa said.
Okay.
A single main author.
That's a different Italian question, maybe. Well, why do they think it wasn't written by an Italian? Why do they think Shakespeare wasn't written by an Italian? You haven't had any Italian candidates. Why wasn't it written? Why was it not
We've included
written by-
Florio in our
in the list.
Not really.
Why was it not written by an Italian?
Given all the Italian connections on the Italian plays.
Well,
There's an awful lot of English stuff in there, probably.
And a Scottish play.
Right. Well, maybe actually you've just given us an idea
know,
for
for
next
next
year's.
year.
Next year's
Shakespeare, the English connection.
okay, let's finish there. Could you please just join me in thanking our speakers who are here.